my name is Zoe Bedford, and I'm here today to talk about my capstone in collaboration with Credit Valley Conservation on identifying forests with old growth potential in the Credit River Watershed. Before getting into that, it's important to identify the importance of old growth forests on the landscape. Old growth forests offer unique and important benefits as a result of their structural characteristics. One such example is enhanced carbon storage due to the presence of old large trees and deadwood. In fact, a study by McGarvey et al. Found that the carbon density of deadwood in old growth forests was 1,800% higher than surrounding secondary growth forests. Another benefit is a diverse array of habitat offered due to the structural variation in these forests. This includes things like canopy gaps, snags, downwoody debris, as well as tip-up mounds. Although the benefits of old growth are immense, there are a unique set of threats and challenges that threaten the permanence of them on the landscape. These can be divided into three broad categories. The first is action-based, which include things like fragmentation or removal of old growth forests from the landscape and replacement through land use change. The second stems from theoretical-based threats that come from a lack of consensus on how to best define old growth, as well as difficulties in creating a scheme to identify these forests given their variable nature. And finally, management-based threats consist of past and current management practices that aren't tailored to retaining old growth features on the landscape. These types of threats may also be reflected based on locational differences in the watershed, such as peri-urban and urban areas having different management practices. So despite the threats and lack of consensus on a definition, there are characteristics of old growth forests that are indicators that are brought up time and time again within the literature. These are the presence of old, large trees, an uneven age structure, the occurrence of pit and mound microtopography, and coarse woody debris in the form of downwoody debris and snags. With these indicators in mind, we set out to research an overarching goal, which was to investigate the potential old growth forest areas in the Credit River watershed. And this was done by creating three sub-objectives. One was to compare indicators in known old growth sites to Ontario to Credit Valley conservation forests. Two was to investigate additional indicators in CVC forests that were highlighted in the literature. And three was to examine measured old growth indicators within the context of peri-urban and urban forests within the watershed. These objectives are in line with those outlined in CVC's Sustainable Forest Management Plan, which targets the identification, protection, and potential restoration of old growth forests. The methods for Objective 1 provide data to compare old growth indicators in CVC forests to old growth forests in Ontario. This is consisted of three surveyed variables: prism sweeps for live tree basal area, prism sweeps for belt transects of snag basal area, as well as transects for downwoody debris volume. Prism sweeps were carried out using basal area factor 2 prisms, and trees that were in the sweep had their DBH, relative canopy position, and species recorded. For snags, we walked a 400-meter transect while using the prism to identify snags within the belt, and then we recorded the DBH, the tree type, as well as the decay class. It's also worth noting that this method for surveying snags is actually quite effective for capturing large snags, which are relatively rare on the landscape. And finally, for downwoody debris, we walked a 400-meter transect again using a hip chain and measuring all pieces of downed wood that intersected with the line. This included measuring the diameter, decay class, and tree type. To establish a point of comparison to known old growth, CVC data will be compared to data collected from Algonquin Provincial Park and Halliburton Forests, henceforth referred to as just Algonquin. The same variables and mensuration techniques were used, and there was a measurement of 34 sites in total. These consisted of 19 logged sites and 15 sites that can be described as old growth. The methods for Objective 2 investigated the additional growth in old growth indicators as described in the literature in just CVC forests. This included tree core data and tip-up mounds. Tree cores were collected from about 10 to 11 old growth trees, with 2 cores being taken from each tree. This yielded a total of 268 cores that contributed towards stand age estimate once they were mounted, sanded, and had their tree rings counted. Data on tip-up mounds was collected by measuring the depth or height of the pit or mound, as well as the length or width of the pit or mound. And this was used to estimate the area of the total area occupied at the site. The methods for objective 3 were designed to address if there's a difference between old growth forest and old growth indicators between peri-urban and urban sites. Out of the 14 total sites, there were 8 sites that were considered to be peri-urban, as shown by the green dots, and there are 6 urban sites, as shown by the yellow dots. The distinction between the sites lies at where they're located within the watershed, with urban sites being contained all within the city of Mississauga city boundaries, as well as being municipal parks, and peri sites being in the northern portion of the watershed with variable management. The results for objective 1 include examining the measured field variables and comparing them against the Algonquin data. So the box plot on the left shows a density of stems greater than 60 centimeters diameter by each treatment. As you can see, the CBC sites have a much higher density of very large stems when compared to logged and old growth sites in Algonquin. The line plot on the right reiterates this by showing the diameter class by a logarithmic density scale. And as you can see in the red box, CBC line deviates from the other 2 lines, indicating a higher density of extremely large stems. This trend was not carried through when examining smaller stems, though. The box plot on the left shows the density of stems less than 38 centimeters diameter by treatment. And as you can see, the median for CBC sites is well below that of the logged and old growth sites in Algonquin. Again, the same line plot from the last slide reiterates this phenomenon, showing a paucity of small stems at CBC sites below the logged and old growth sites. The box plots on the left show snag basal area by treatment for small and early decay snags, with early decay snags being decay classes 1 and 2. Snags are classified, As you can see, the median for the snag basal area for small and early decay snags for CBC forests far surpasses that found in logged and old growth forests in Algonquin. The box plot on the right reflects snag basal area by treatment, but for large and late decay snags, where late decay is defined as being from 3 to 5 decay class. Here we see that CBC sites have a basal area for snags that's much more comparable to logged sites, while old growth sites have the highest basal area of these types of snags. Similar box plots have been created for downwoody debris, and they reflect similar trends. The box plot on the left shows the volume of downwoody debris by treatment for small and early decay logs. And here we see again, CBC has far surpassed those found in the logged and old growth treatments at Algonquin. The box plot on the right shows the volume of large and late decay DWD treatments by treatment. Again, CBC has a lower median value for DWD than even the log sites, and especially the old growth sites. This slide displays principal component analysis for both snags on the left and DWD on the right. And similar stories are told by the box plot, but these provide a little bit more detail. First, looking at the snags on the left, we can see that CBC sites were mostly characterized by both small and large early decayed wood. This is almost in opposition to Algonquin old growth sites, which were characterized by large and late decayed snags. And this is consistent with what's been found in the literature. Now moving on to the plot on the right, the PCA for downwoody debris shows a trend that's not as distinct, but still present. CBC sites were more characterized by both small and large early decay downwoody debris, with some overlap with old growth sites. Old growth sites were more characterized by late decayed wood in both size classes, but more so with large late decay. Now moving on to the results for objective 2, which looked at tree age and tip-ups for just CBC sites. The PCA on the left shows the relationship between total tip-up area and tree age. With all the vectors pointing to the right, this indicates a weak positive relationship between occupied area occupied by tip-ups and stand age. The PCA on the right shows the relationship between large and late decayed snags, large late decay downwoody debris, tree age, basal area of large live trees, and total tip-up area. While this slide looks a little bit messy, it's really important to note what's actually circled in the slide, which is the strong positive relationship between large late decay downwoody debris and snags with tree age, indicating that as tree age increases, these variables are also increasing. Table on the left shows a score for old growth indicators as shown on the previous PCA, with cells in green performing the best, being ranked from 14 down to 1. The scores were then given a total score of old growthiness by site, and the two best performing sites were CW and SF. It's also just exciting to point out that Scottsdale Farm, or the SF site, had the oldest tree cord in the whole study, dating back to 1775, which was about 246 years ago. When investigating the difference between peri-urban and urban sites in CVC, we found no statistically significant difference for any of the variables measured. On the left is just a representative of one such case, which is small early decay for snags. And this is also reiterated on the right, which shows a PCA, but now is color-coded for the urban or peri-urban sites. And we can see that there's no clear trend of grouping between the sites, indicating no sort of trend in difference between peri-urban and urban sites. The data indicate that CVC forests have an abundance of giant trees, and this is especially true when compared to old growth Algonquin sites. This could be due to milder climate, but it could also be a factor of just management practices on the landscape, selectively choosing these sites to be preserved and conserved because of their large trees. Data also presented a lack of small stems in CVC sites when compared to logged and old growth forests in Algonquin. This could present a unique challenge of a ghost forest, where there are beautiful large canopy trees, but an absence of a cohort to replace these trees. This could be caused by a number of challenges and stresses that are facing peri-urban and urban forests, such as browsing, shading, or even regeneration suppression from invasive species. But further investigation is required to really understand what's going on here. Notably, CVC had an abundance of small early decay downwoody debris, and this is most likely a remnant of the EAB infestations found in a lot of the sites. And this is also probably true, explaining why there are large early decay snags and downwoody debris as well. But this is really promising because large early decay has the potential to transform into large late decay, which we now know are key indicators of old growth. The lack of large late decay wood in CVC forests compared to Algonquin sites could indicate a difference in management history and practices, such as potentially removing snags due to the safety risks that they pose. But since this is also reflected in downwoody debris, it's most likely that these forests have just not had the permanence or the time on the landscape yet to develop multiple old growth cohort systems to produce large, old, coarse woody debris. As shown on the PCAs for microtopography, there was a weak positive relationship with tip-up area and stand age. This weak relationship could be attributed just to a small sample size and its sampling design not best tuned to measure these features since they are quite rare on the landscape. PCAs for old growth indicators revealed that large late decay snags and downwoody debris are the strongest indicators of old growth in CVC forests, meaning that older sites tend to have these variables as well. And these results are encouraging because they are in line with the literature, which is not generally focused on more urban or peri-urban sites. There's also no significant difference uncovered between peri-urban and urban sites within the watershed across all measured variables, but this might also be attributed just to a smaller sample size. Finally, just to bring it back to the core indicators of old growth, CVC has the components to have amazing old growth forests within the watershed. These forests just need fostering and real undisturbed time to mature and develop a full suite of old growth indicators. These are the people I would like to thank to make this project possible. Here are my references, and thank you.
Very much, Zoe. Laura has some questions, I believe.
Hi, Zoe. Great presentation. Great work. Thank you. I can't wait to read the full report to get into a lot of those details. In the meantime, my first question for you is, aside from just waiting, I guess, are there any active management practices you would recommend in order for us to help foster the development of old growth at these sites?
That's a really great question. The first order of business I would choose to address is investigating why there's actually this absence of small stems happening in a lot of these sites. So investigating whether that's because of increased ground cover of invasive species or regeneration suppression from browsing or shading. And by investigating this, you'll be able to better tune what management practices you'll need to sort of create a release of these small regeneration. And then that will sort of move you along the path of a more uneven age structure associated with old growth forests. Another, well, I don't know, a lot of it is just waiting, like waiting for wood to decay, unfortunately. But yeah, the management for the small stems would be something that is a little bit more active.
I can't remember if you presented this, but did you look at the difference between the urban and peri-urban sites in terms of the amount of small regen?
Yes, I didn't present it, but basically there was no relationship with any of the variables found. And I just think that this is most likely due to a smaller sample size than anything else.
I was wondering if you had anecdotal impressions about the differences between those two classes of sites in the understory. I'm thinking, you know, I was at a few of these sites with you, and the understory and the ones that are more urban obviously had a lot more pressure from recreational uses, even in the removal of the woody debris, right? So if you have any thoughts on that, just anecdotally.
I mean, yeah, definitely. There are the pressures of trails running through the more urban sites. There was one instance, this is a bit strange, but we were out and some person was just hacking down small stems. Like they weren't doing it while we were there, but they were there. They were knocked over, and we were there the day previously, and they were standing. So I don't know what people are doing. There's definitely the potential for influence on people just suppressing smaller regen through things like trampling or apparently taking a hack, like a hatchet to it. But yeah.
Thanks.
Good job, Zoe. I was just wondering, I'm going to follow up on Laura's question basically, and that is, on one hand, you said we just let these forests keep going, and this big decay, early decay class will transition to late decay class, which is totally true. But at the same time, I don't think you can really stop wood decaying, so you don't need to worry about that too much. But my question is more to this potential of ghost forests, which we were sort of seeing the same thing in Rouge, where you have these really gorgeous big forests, but then there's like hardly any understory. And I was going to challenge you here to think about, like, if you were going to start designing experiments to test these competing hypotheses, what do you think would be some key things you could try?
Well, the first would be just to test like regeneration based on the different height classes. Bridget has a presentation coming up, which would be really interesting to implement. Yeah, and then also just quantifying and looking at the diversity of ground cover. So a lot of the sites that were characterized by, just anecdotally, a lot of the sites were characterized by less old growth indicators, just were more disturbed in general. There's lots of sort of early ruderal species and invasive species present at these sort of sites. So that would be sort of my first idea of how to best tackle that. And then also there is a relationship between, I think, also between the lack of small stems and just the abundance of early small decay snags. EAB really did a number on a lot of these forests and wiped out sort of a whole cohort, I think. So because these forests have a high presence of ash, it would be sort of understanding what's coming up next, whether it be sugar maple or oak or whatever.
Do you think there's a role for actual experiments in these kinds of forests where, for example, a good one for browse is just to do exclosures? You put up fences and keep things out. A good one for invasive species, of course, would be invasive species control. A good one for light would actually be to do a bit of harvesting. Do you think we can afford to do such sorts of experiments?
Invasive species control and invasive and browsing control, I think, could be easily implemented. I don't know if like increasing the canopy, like decreasing the canopy cover would really be very feasible in forests that have been sort of marked as being old growth, especially in line with sort of CVC's philosophies and principles. But yeah, the other experiments could definitely be feasible. They would just need to be tuned to their location. So a lot of the urban sites have a lot of foot traffic and people running through them. So you'd have to be mindful of that as well.
It's a great work, and I'm glad you see what's happening in Southern Ontario all over the place. I like the term ghost. Yeah.
Jay came up with that.
Yeah, that's all over the place of Southern Ontario. So what do you think, how management practices play the role in what you see? That's the first question. So let's go with that.
So I'm not quite so sure about current management practices because it's my understanding that a lot of these forests that are managed by City of Mississauga or CBC are just sort of left to do their own thing. I think it's more sort of remnants of previous management practices, such as any sorts of like previous logging or clearing or removal of snags just for safety risks. So I think that the management history sort of has reached its tendrils into the future and is impacting that more so than current management practices.
Yeah, that was my question. Past management practices, that's the
Sorry.
Yeah.
Past management practices. That is a good question. I'm not too familiar with past management practices within the watershed, but I imagine a lot of these forests, especially in urban areas, are cleared and like remnants of larger forests. So just introducing that element of disturbance of clearing the landscape around it would really impact what's actually going on in the remnant left.
They're working forests, like 200 years of use, either in urban or peri-urban. The other question I had, what was your reasoning for selection? How did you select your site?
Yeah, so I selected my sites based on the ELC data provided by CBC that had some indication, just anecdotal indications of whether forests were mature or not, as well as the species. And then I also looked at the 1954 aerial photos for the watershed and determined if forests were there in 1954, because a lot of the forests say that they're old growth, but then there's huge patches of them missing. And then also there was a FRI that was done, and someone went through all of them and looked at sites in the year 2000 that were considered to be old growth then. So I used that sort of as my basis, just a combination of all three to select my sites.
Okay, thank you.
Zoe, just as I'm walking over to Ben, I was wondering about the comparison to Algonquin Park and Credit Valley, because, you know, you put them in the ordination and they turned out to be different, but I would sort of expect that they would be different because they're sort of in different places. Can you explain your choice to compare those two?
Sorry, which two?
Your comparison to old growth in Algonquin and the CVC lands, and those forests are separated by a fair bit of distance. So it seems like they might be different for other reasons than old growth status. Can you elaborate on that choice of comparison?
Yeah, the choice of comparison there is really just partially because there is no baseline of old growth data in this region of Ontario. The literature for old growth in Ontario is really small. The literature for urban and peri-urban old growth is also even smaller. But also the point of comparison between Algonquin and CVC is actually not too far off when just considering the species in general. The species in CVC skew a little bit more Carolinian, but there are still present species from like Great Lakes, St. Lawrence region. So the comparison's not too far off.
Good job, Zoe. I have, funnily enough, a related question. And that is, if you looked at the role of species in the relationship to do with, I think you found that CVC had lots of old, large stems and large decaying wood. But I would wonder if you looked at the species at the same time or at all, and how those compared with the large diameter stuff you found in the old growth.
So for this analysis, I didn't, but I have some sort of anecdotal information. Generally, the biggest stems were always going to be red oaks and white oaks. but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily the oldest. The oldest stems I generally cored were the hemlock and eastern white cedar. There's also been a lot of really large sugar maples, but yeah, I would generally say the diameter distribution for larger stems skews towards red oak and sugar maple and some white oak as well.
So would it be fair to assume that if these forests were relatively open grown at some point in time, that there's a factor there, right? Not only species, but location in terms of putting on size. I just wonder how much the size effect is related to age or old growthiness in CBC.
The size effect in terms of just large tree basal area is actually not super well correlated with age. As mentioned previously, the best indicators are largely decay coarse woody debris. This is just because, again, going back to Daniela's point, like the management history of these sites is not super well known. So it's possible that these trees can be just really large because they are more open canopy. The canopy was released at one point. It's also dependent on like the location and like the soil quality, all sorts of different factors. So the basal area, or actually the size of the stems, was not super well correlated to the age or old growthiness.
All right, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Zoe.
Thank you.